Let me just ask you, what do you think are the ingredients of good public space?
Well, first of all, public space is accessible to the public. It's not fenced in or it's not secured. It's open and accessible. It offers some public amenities. Mm-hmm. It needs to have a certain density of both you feeling safe and at the same time feeling that you're comfortable in that particular location. So there is an element of friendliness in public space that is necessary, And then at the same time, of course, it varies. Is it a hardscape or is it a park? Is it green? Is it lush? Is it mono-oriented or is it complex and diversified? So the typologies of outdoor spaces is enormous, as many as we have in architecture when it comes to typologies, at least. And the public space, first of all, needs to be accessible. I think that's the starting point. If you assume that you seclude certain groups of people simply by the way you build up whatever that place has to offer, then you're already being biased towards a larger group of people. So, for instance, in Norway, the integration policies are not ideal because first they agree on their differences and then they try to agree afterwards instead of doing it the other way around. First agreeing on whatever is the same and then trying to agree on the differences later. So in a way, there are human needs, basic human needs that do appear in public space.
Right.
It can't be too polluted. You have to be able to breathe. You have to be able in hot areas to find protection against the sun. In wet areas, you have to find protection against the water. So public space is also contextual, like architecture is in many ways.
Right.
You have to react to the situations accordingly around the world and try to provide either shadow or other kinds of protection for people to feel comfortable and safe.
Right. Central to the idea of public space is the question of density, I imagine. And there can be too much density, which then compromises public space or maybe vitalizes it. I don't know. Maybe it has the inverse effect. I mean, I'm thinking of a comparison between, say, a plaza in Oslo versus a public space in Hong Kong. I mean, these are two completely different densities.
Yes.
And I wonder if Snøhetta has a position on how to think about this balance between public and private realms, or the gradation of public space that happens in different cities in different parts of the world.
Yeah, during the Corona period, the Nordic countries used to say, very unhappy with the 2-meter distance because they couldn't wait to get back to the 5. So, there is this notion of density for sure. And again, it's contextual, it's cultural.
Right.
So, of course, there's a much higher degree of density in Hong Kong and will always be. People accept more closeness. When you come to the further north you come, the bigger the distances are and the less density there is. I prefer, I have to say, the acknowledgement of a slightly higher density than what we have in the Nordic countries, simply because it's more sustainable.
Right.
You have the density as part of sustainability thinking. If you make a plaza and it's empty all year, you made it for nobody. You just spent the money and the CO2 in order to get there. It doesn't make sense. It increases for the one person going onto that plaza, his or her personal CO2 footprint massively. It's like flying alone on a plane. It's not ideal. So when we increase density in public spaces, it's also not only a social element to it, but there is also an environmental element to it. And I think a lot of the things that we're dealing with today have to do and are dealing with exactly the same issues, whether it's whatever is built is basically dealing with the same element.
Right. Actually, you do have a project in Hong Kong, and it has a very large central public space. What struck me about that, is that the response to density is then that the public space is elevated. It's a ground above ground, so to speak, the architecture moves in the z-axis, so to speak. The ground gets replicated. Obviously, there's not much use for that in Norway.
No, not in the same way. But I think using the city twice, whatever you do with it, or 3 times, is of course better than using it only once. I mean, that's pure economy. So to some extent, when we do elevated public spaces in dense situations like airside in Hong Kong, it's really about utilizing the ground. Because on one hand, commercial buildings should not have a footprint higher than they need, because they should not be occupying communal ground. So that's why I approve for commercial projects to go up high, whereas housing should be lower. And culture should be completely low. They are allowed, if it's public culture, they are allowed to have a bigger footprint. Housing could be in between, but commercials should go up high because they are not allowed to take more of the Earth's surface than necessary. And that's why you have to provide public space in any case. So then it makes sense to use the site 2 or 3 times by elevated public access at different levels, in order for people to engage with the building again.
Right.
And I think both the public spaces outside and inside then become extremely important also for commercial buildings, right, like in Hong Kong. But on the other hand, you can always ask the question, does it make a difference then? You can always say, so who are you actually providing a better world for by doing elevated? Only those people who can afford and buy things in these shops, or what? So it's a semi-private situation usually, because you are already, you don't allow for full diversity in a high-end building. It's almost impossible, because only people who can afford to be there are there. Right. And they will utilize the public space differently. So it's almost like semi-private, or semi-public at least.
Well, if I remember Hong Kong, a lot of the elevated public spaces are 24/7 free to access. Yeah. I mean, but
Hong Kong is actually quite good at dealing with its public in the high density they have.
Right.
Because they have this precision in the transition between the city and the jungle, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, in Hong Kong, it's like within a meter of a facade, you have the jungle. Yes. It's fantastic.
Which project do you think represents urban renewal through the revitalization of public space?
Well, I think in our case, it's definitely Times Square, because in New York, because it was so full of traffic, I mean, it was like overloaded completely.
Kjetil, if I may, just to recap, large swaths of area around 42nd and 47th Streets were pedestrianized. And so you basically doubled the amount of public space, got rid of the curbs, got rid of the clutter, introduced seating and benches and so on.
And you asked the question earlier, what needs to be in a public space? Well, what doesn't need to be there are cars. Because cars have a footprint that ruin everything that is dealing with true city life. They're only about driving and parking. And whatever they do, they take too much space. So when the cars were removed through Jan Gehl's first studies on the pedestrianization of Times Square, there was a clear indication that this would probably only have a positive effect on Times Square per se, and how it was used, not only by tourists, but also by the inhabitants of New York. And what happens then, when you remove the cars, you locate a body in a position where before there were only cars. So you see your city in a new way. All of a sudden you're located in a place where you've never ever been in your city, except inside a car driving through. It's crazy, and we saw that. We were providing the benches and the public amenities that were there for people. they would get up on the benches and stand on the benches to have full view of this new position in the middle of Times Square, where before there were only cars and buses and whatever. And it's crazy. They see the city, their own city, in a new way.
The removal of cars, according to the data, suggests that pedestrian injuries dropped by something like 40%. Accidents were reduced by 15%. The one that surprised me the most, and the first two are expected, but the third one was the crime rate decreased by 20%. I don't understand why crime would go down because cars are gone out, but that is
it's actually less aggressive.
Less aggressive, right? Okay.
I would say, the way of hiding away, you have more public watching every square meter of Times Square. It's, I wouldn't say public control, but it's definitely a way of reacting towards the atmosphere that is being generated there. And in addition to that, of course, pollution went down massively. Air pollution.
Right.
And the turnover for the shops went up.
Right.
So there wasn't really one measurable negative consequence. And the interesting thing was they did not even predict where these cars that were no longer able to drive along Times Square, where they would go. So they just blocked it. And the cars, it's like water. Right. They found a way around. But nobody knew where they were going to go.
But there was an additional congestion in the area, on the surrounding areas as a result of the new pedestrian.
Yes, of course. And of course, impatience. So there's always a knock-on effect somewhere, but not to the extent that Manhattan didn't work.